O God, our refuge and strength, who art the author of godliness, be ready, we beseech thee, to hear the devout prayers of thy church, and grant that those things which we ask faithfully may be obtained effectually through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Verse 1 of hymn 327. Draw nigh and take... Okay, gone. Now my tongue, 329. Now my tongue the mystery telling, of the glorious body sing, and the blood price excelling, which Gentiles Lord and King, once on earth among us dwelling, shed for this world's ransoming. Thomas Aquinas. Well, we are looking at the Memoirs of Simon Episcopius, celebrated pupil of Arminius, subsequently Doctor of Divinity in the University of Leyden. Also the place where Francis Gomarus was a doctor and lecturer as well. Simon Episcopius was a Doctor of Divinity. He was condemned by the Synod of Dordt as a dangerous heretic, and with several other ministers was sentenced to perpetual banishment by the civil authorities of Holland for holding the doctrine of general redemption, to which is added a brief account of the Synod of Dordt, the sufferings to which the followers of Arminius were exposed in consequence of their attachment to his opinions, by Frederick, Calder. And then we've got a quote from Mosheim, who we're studying in another series. Simon Episcopius, the disciple of Arminius, was admired even by his enemies on account of the depth of his judgment, the extent of his learning, and the force of his eloquence. And another quote by Sir J. Mackintosh. The Calvinists now punished with death those dissenters who had only followed the examples of the most renowned of Protestant reformers by a rebellion against authority for the sake of maintaining the paramount sovereignty of reason. Published in London, 1835. Preface. The subject of these memoirs lived in an age marked by fierce theological strife, is carried on between the followers of Calvin and Arminius. The prominent part he took in this conflict, with the extraordinary talents he displayed in the defense of Arminianism, and the sufferings to which he was exposed in consequence of his attachment to it, have given his name distinction in the religious history of the 17th century. Nevertheless, as an extended account of him is only to be found in foreign publications, it is hoped that the following memoirs, chiefly selected from his works, will not be unacceptable. The design of the writer in publish this work is to present an impartial portrait of the character of Episcopius, which has been greatly misrepresented by bigoted and prejudiced authors. The Synod of Dordt, by which he was condemned as a heretic, divested his honors as a scholar, deprived of his office as a professor, and excluded from the ministry for defending the doctrines of Arminius, is particularly noticed in the following pages, whilst his banishment from Holland, the imprisonment of his brother ministers, the prohibition of the religious assemblies of the Remonstrants, the fines inflicted upon some of them, the confiscation of the property of others, and the butchery of several, under the direction of Dutch Calvinistic authorities, by a ruthless soldiery, when detected in celebrating divine worship, are alluded to in the spirit of fidelity and not of acrimony and bigotry. The imprisonment of Grotius and the judicial assassination of Barnfeldt, the two great lay defenders of the Arminian cause, it was thought, were events deserving a place in the work professing to give a history of the affairs of the Remonstrants. As the patron and able advocate of religious toleration, the reader will learn in perusing these memoirs how much is due to the memory of Episcopius on account of his labors in behalf of so important and righteous a cause. The progress of religious opinion since the Synod of Dordt and its approximation to the benevolent and expansive views of Arminius, both on the continent and in this country, has been noticed as contributing to generate a spirit of tolerance amongst various religious bodies, while the existence of that Christian sympathy in the various sections of the Church, manifested in the adoption of measures designed to bring the whole family of man under the hallowed teachings of the gospel, is traced to the same cause. The writer had intended to have appended to these memoirs a translation of the Confession of the Remonstrants as drawn up by Episcopius, but from the extent to which he has carried out his work, he is compelled, though reluctantly, to abandon this part of the design. Of this confession, it has been said by a former translator in his address to the reader, touching the worth of this work as a summary of Christian religion: if Dr. Jeremy Taylor's judgment be of credit with thee, I am credibly informed he should prefer it to be one of those two or three which, next to the Holy Bible, he would have preserved from the supposed total destruction of books, a high encomium from the mouth of so learned a pious divine. The Remonstrants, in their preface to this work, say, it has been submitted to our brethren, not excepting those who are in prisons and dungeons, and carefully examined and compared by them in the fear of the Lord with the Holy Scriptures, and now without one dissenting voice is approved and set forth by us to vindicate our opinions, free ourselves from the charge of gross heresy, and maintain our innocence against the foul and calumnious accusations which have been brought against us. As a substitute for this incomparable confession, we have in an index given the opinions of the Remonstrants on the 5 points as presented by them to the Synod of Dordt, adding thereto from the confession their sentiments on the subject of the Holy Trinity, that the reader himself may judge whether, according to their own statement, they merited to be condemned as heretics and banished from their fatherland. Mosheim says that they were thus treated for maintaining that the love of God extends itself equally to all mankind, that no mortal is rendered unhappy by an eternal and invincible decree, and that the misery of those that perish comes from themselves. The writer here begs to leave to record his acknowledgments to Thomas Walker, Esquire of Stockton, for procuring for him, through the medium of his connections on the continent, several works necessary to enable him to compose the following memoirs, as also to Mr. Nichols of London for the loan of several Dutch works presented to him by Arminian clergymen in Holland after the publication of his translation of the works of Arminius. It is unnecessary to give the titles of the several publications consulted in drawing up these memoirs, they being scarce books in the Dutch and German languages. Only the writer would remark that he has principally obtained his materials from Leven van Simon Episcopius by Limborch, and the more enlarged edition translated into Latin, and Bentham's Holländischer Kirche und Schulenstaat, a singular rare melange of German, Dutch, Latin, and French, giving a history of all sects existing in Holland shortly after the time of Episcopius, with the confession of each church, a brief memoir of its most eminent ministers, and whatever was deemed interesting in its history, extending through 1,700 pages. At the end of it, Chapter 1, Persecutions of Charles V and Philip II, a combination of the European Catholic monarchs to crush Protestantism, Dutch courage, introduction of Protestantism into the Netherlands, character of Arminius, his change of sentiments, hyper-Calvinism in Holland, Chapter 2, State of the Militant Church, birth of Episcopius, early education, Dutch Church, Episcopius sent to Leyden, quits Leyden after obtaining the degree of Master of Arts, preaches his first sermon, becomes acquainted with Utenbogart, epitome of the sentiments of Gomarus and Arminius, Episcopius invited by the people of Gouda to be their minister. Chapter 3, Episcopius goes to Franeker, disputes with Dr. Sibrandus, and inquires fame by it, visits Arminius before his death, returns to Franeker and again disputes with Sibrandus, the treatment of the latter towards him, remarks on Episcopius's conduct in disputing with this professor. Chapter 4, Constitution of the Dutch Church, Episcopius's call to the ministry, intolerance of the Calvinist ministers, Episcopius invited by the people of Bleiswyk to become their minister, his examination and the opposition of the Calvinist clergy to his being set apart to ministry, finally appointed minister of Bleiswyk. Chapter 5, Episcopius's popularity as a preacher, a remonstrance presented to the states of Holland by the Arminian clergy, containing the 5 points from whence they obtained the name remonstrance, origin of the Dutch confession, confession at Hague, Episcopius invited by the magistrates of Utrecht to become their pastor, chosen professor of theology in the University of Leyden, commences his exposition on the 2nd and 3rd chapters of the book of Revelation. False reports concerning him. Chapter 6, Episcopius stands sponsor for his brother's child. Treatment he met in consequence. Commences his comment on the first epistle of St. John. Visits Paris. False reports of his holding correspondence with Peter Cotton, the head of the Jesuits. Chapter 7, Character of Festus Homigus, charges Episcopius with Socinianism. Episcopius refutes the charge before the curators of the University of Leyden. Chapter 8, Polyander, the colleague of Episcopius, is jealous of the fame of the latter, treats him rudely. Schism created in the church by the Contra-Remonstrants. Goulart deposed from his ministry for refuting the doctrine of the reprobation of infants. Superiority of Baxter's system to that of President Edwards. Remonstrants commence holding separate religious assemblies at Amsterdam. Riots occasioned by it. Rembishkop's house plundered. Reformed called Guizes. Chapter 9, Venator charged with heterodoxy. Conduct of Episcopius and Polyander in the affair. Episcopius's interview with the Princes Henry and Maurice. Preaches at The Hague. charged with heresy by the hyper-Calvinists and the testimony to his orthodoxy. Maurice begins to manifest his intention of seizing the reins of government, measure preparatory to the assembling of the Synod of Dordt, Episcopius's oration in the University of Leyden before going to Dordt. Chapter 10, Synod of Dordt, object for which it was assembled, treatment of the remonstrants. Remonstrants cited to Dordt appear in the Synod. Episcopius's oration before the Synod, effect of the oration, conduct of Bogerman on the occasion, Episcopius charged with falsehood, the testimony of his brethren in vindication of his character. Chapter 11, the remonstrants' protest against the legality of the Synod, excitement occasioned by it in the Synod, boldness of the remonstrants. They challenged the members of the Synod to debate with them. Commissioners sent to the Hague to inform the states of the proceedings of the Synod. The states approved the conduct of its members. Efforts made to terrify the remonstrants into obedience to the wishes of the Synod. Dismissal of the remonstrants from the Synod and the abusive language of Bogerman. Conduct of the remonstrants vindicated. Chapter 12. The remonstrants allowed to prepare certain writings on the 5 points to be presented to the Synod. Their courage in refusing to have any further transactions with the Synod. Canons of the Synod. Bulk and Qual's opinion of them. Close of the sittings of the Synod. Feast given in it to its members and a medal struck on the occasion. Chapter 13, Barnevelt, his character, arrest, trial, and execution. 14, remonstrants sent for to the Synod, sentence read to them. Episcopius's reply, departure of the remonstrants into banishment, arrive at Warwick in Brabant, conduct of the Bishop of Bois-du-Lac. Episcopius publishes his Synode Dorticanae Crudelis Iniquitas. Remonstrants publish acts and scripts of Synodalia Remonstrantium. The confession, Grotius's approval of it, mode of approval of it by the remonstrant ministers vindicated. Chapter 15. Persecuting spirit of the Calvinist ministers in Holland. Eject all Arminian ministers from their offices. Cruel treatment of the remonstrants. Their submission to it by the persuasion of their ministers. Shot by the soldiers for assembling for religious worship. Ministers preached during the winter upon the ice. Administer the sacrament to the people in the street. Arminian ministers not allowed Christian burial. Papias and Nielius, 2 distinguished Arminian clergymen, imprisoned and threatened with the rack, conducted to the Loevestein. Nielius sings on the road. Bishop summoned before the bishops, magistrates of Amsterdam, compelled to escape, returns, summoned before the consistory, excommunicated with several others. Dr. Samuel Coster's pun on the occasion. Review of the conduct of the Calvinist ministers in persecuting the Arminian clergy. Chapter 16, Episcopius, courted by the Catholics. Rights on the worship of images. The Spaniards endeavor in vain to induce the remonstrants to join them against the country. Noble reply of Uten Bogart to the Marquis of Cueva on the occasion. Episcopius in Paris writes several works in defense of the remonstrants. His work on the freedom of will, Maurice's death. Episcopius returns to Holland, writes in defense of the confession, issues other publications, chosen minister of Rotterdam by remonstrants. Chapter 17. Several ministers escape from Loevestein, received by Episcopius. Episcopius made professor of theology in the Theological College of the Remonstrants, prepares his theological institutes, marries, writes several tracts against popery, his death and interment. Episcopius's character, judgment of several learned men concerning his works, his love of toleration, capabilities as a commentator. Chapter 19, cause of the failure of the Synod of Dordt to effect the object designed by its convocation on the part of the Dutch Calvinistic clergy. Cameron and his system, Amarut, his disciple, spread of his theory in France and Holland, adoption of it by Baxter in England, modern Calvinism, causes contributing to the milder system in the followers of the Geneva Reformer, spirit of tolerance and unity among Christians, with an appendix. Hell is a big but he's basically will be reviewing to talk about Episcopius and Arminius. Is you got to bring up all the Arminian stuff. Introductory chapter in presenting a memoir to the reader of the person whose name is prefixed to this volume. The writer cannot resist the inclination he feels to notice some of the most remarkable events in the history of the Netherlands prior to the birth of this distinguished man. These were so deeply interesting as to excite the attention of all Europe. They originated with the dark and suspicious spirit of Philip II, the bigoted monarch of Spain. This prince was prompted to direct a large portion of the forces of his empire against his Belgic subjects for the purpose of destroying their liberties and arresting the progress of the Reformation, which had found its way amongst them. They had previously been visited with the displeasure of Charles V, the father of Philip, for having dared to adopt a religious creed differing from that he wished to impose on them. The early part of this monarch's reign was distinguished by the tremendous forms of persecution, so that in the space of a few years, not less than 50,000 of his Flemish subjects were destroyed either by fire, or other modes of torture equally cruel and sanguinary. We're okay. But instead of the spirit of inquiry being allayed by these cruelties, it seemed to be excited to a greater activity, and the principles he thus endeavored to extirpate spread more widely in spite of these severities. This fact being witnessed by Mary, Queen of Hungary, sister to the emperor and governor of the Low Countries, she endeavored to soften the emperor and invited him to the Low Countries to behold with his eyes how persecution begat heresy. Charles wisely listened to her advice and prudently gave up his severities. But Philip, his son and successor, was incapable of being softened by any such circumstance. And while the spread of the doctrines of the Reformation seemed to be in proportion to the number of his victims, so his malignant heart burned with more intense feelings of cruelty and more determined purposes of destruction. Hence, when one of his ministers represented to him the probability of the general revolt of the Belgic provinces, unless the severity of the Inquisition were mitigated, he said, "I had rather be without subjects than to be the king of subjects." The man who could utter this sentiment in cool blood, and Philip was rarely otherwise, was capable of the foulest deeds. To attempt to draw a portrait of this personage is no less pleasing task, and if one half be true, which is asserted of him by historians, the picture must be deeply shaded. Gifted with powerful talents, they were blighted and paralyzed by mistrust, like a dark specter, hunted and spellbound by all his powers. Cold, cruel, haughty, suspicious, he treated with studied reserve. Get some footnotes here. She was suspected by the Pope of heresy. His cold reserve and disdainful conduct in one instance was attended with singular effect. An inquisitor who had been accustomed to be treated with that dignified freedom Charles V showed his principal subjects went to wait upon Philip, but being kept in the antechamber till his patience was exhausted, he at length pressed forward into the presence of Philip, as he was wont to do in Charles' time. But though his object was that of procuring another bloody placard, which must have been pleasing to the king, nevertheless he received him with such cold and haughty disdain that the inquisitor left his presence, gnashing his teeth with rage, and retired to the house of President Vigilius, where he fell down, became deranged, and died shortly after in a state of madness. Governed by selfishness, dissimulation, pride, and love of power, he was a stranger to pity, benevolence, and humanity. Religion with him was a mere superstition, and partook more of the nature of a moral disease than that of a salutary remedy. And instead of spreading, we're talking about Philip II here, instead of spreading a bland and softening influence over his character, it only gave the force of principle to the purposes of a heart naturally cruel, and it sanctioned to his bigoted vengeance in favor of the superstitious dogmas of Rome. In his character was seen the incongruous association of the bigoted devotee and foul debauchee. With him, to murder in defense of popery was piety, while to listen to the cries of a suffering victim with anything like the yearnings of pity would have been deemed an unpardonable sin. Hence, when witnessing an auto da fe in the city of Valladolid, and sitting in the sight of the unhappy victims, one of them, a Protestant nobleman by the name of Don Carlos de Cesa, when being led by the executioners to the stake, called out to the king for mercy, saying, "And canst thou thus, O king, witness the torments of thy subjects? Save us from this cruel death. We do not deserve it." And the footnote has continued from the last page. So early this haughty spirit of disdain show itself in Philip, that it is related of him that even in his childish years, when his father on one occasion made his entry into Antwerp and was received by the magistrates and people with profound respect, Philip beheld it all without once moving his bonnet, which so provoked Charles that he gave the young urchin a box on the ear in the presence of all the people, saying, "Did Vivas, your preceptor, teach you these manners?" While in England as the husband of Mary, he suffered the chief nobility to remain in his presence without taking any notice of them. Burnet says his carriage was such that the acting him and his Spaniards was one of the great diversions of Queen Elizabeth's court. Mariana, a bigoted Catholic, says he was a prince remarkable for some virtues, as liberality, resolution, vigilance. Auto da fe means blasphemously, as it means an act of faith. And here we'll call it to an end. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.